Hi everybody, this is Maya Good, and I am reviewing Joan Didion, The Year of Magical Thinking. I was going to do spoilers at the end, but I realized there really isn't a way to spoil this book because not much happens outside of what's on the back of the book jacket. It's really just an exploration of emotions. So you're getting one video. I started this book over a year ago, couldn't get through it, put it down, took it off my Goodreads. In November, I picked it back up, started reading it again, set it down again. Then I started reading it a third time, had to reread it from the beginning, set it down again. I put this book down so many times that when I got finished, I was just thankful that it was done and I didn't have to look at it anymore. I think that kind of tells you how I feel about this book. This book is it's a memoir about the year after Joan Didion's husband died. This is all on the book jacket. I'm not spoiling anything. Her daughter was in the hospital with some sort of infection. She was in a coma. And about 5 days later, her husband died of a heart attack. And then her daughter didn't come out of the coma until like a month later. And then a little bit after the funeral, because they waited to have the funeral until the daughter was awake. And then after the funeral, the daughter ended up in the hospital again. With brain bleed and almost died. So that's a lot for any woman to go through. And I was really fascinated by the amount of emotional insight, scientific insights, how true parts of this book rang for me, having gone through the process of grieving. There are parts of this book that very much ring true. And I think it is a great book to read if you're dealing with grief. I think it's a great book to read if you like more dry academic style memoirs. And that's my problem with it. I haven't read memoir in a really long time, haven't been reading a lot of nonfiction. So I give that my issues with the book may be partially with me. But Joan Didion typically writes, what I know of Joan Didion, she wrote a lot of articles in magazines, in Cosmo, and all these articles that were really essays. She's a huge essayist, and she writes a little bit more academically, which is fine. But in a memoir that has so much emotional content, for me, it took away from the experience of reading it. And it actually... there were multiple times during the reading of this book where I was bored. I started reading it hardback, and I got about halfway through the book. It's not a long book. It's like 250 pages. Literally, I should have read it in a night. Like, I've read longer books in a night, and this book took me like a year to get through. So I read half of it on paper, and then I just was so fed up. I thought, well, maybe audiobook would be better. So I picked up the audiobook. Finished it on audiobook, gave the paperback book to the library, because originally I had a copy when I was in California, got rid of all my books. And so I went ahead and borrowed a copy in November, and I just couldn't get through it. So I went ahead and got the audiobook version. The narrator is amazing in this book, and she really lent personality to the prose when there wasn't any. She was easier to listen to, but very little of what was said in the second half of the book actually stayed with me. I couldn't tell you, like right now, if you were to ask me, what insights into grieving did she have? What details happened when she was at this hospital? I couldn't tell you because whole parts of my brain were just checked out, and I would have to rewind it and re-listen to parts of it, just like I was having to do on paper when I would read a chapter and then go back and reread it because I wasn't sure exactly like what happened, because when I was done, I forgot it all because nothing was sticking. There wasn't any emotion, there wasn't any personality to make the text stick in my head. It felt very dry, very distant, very academic, which I get. It's very hard to write memoir about grief, and to write it so soon after it happened. You're either going to be right in it, or you're going to have to distance yourself like way far away so you can write it. And she took the distance approach, and it really fell flat for me. this book is considered a classic, and I think it's important that people read it. I think if you're going through grieving while you're reading it, it actually might be very cathartic for someone, because the insights were so good and there were points that felt really real, especially when she's describing this process of thinking magically, of feeling like, well, maybe if I do this, then he won't be dead, or then he'll come back, but not really thinking that, but having that in your subconscious. That felt so real and so fascinating, but I needed the emotion to go with it. And in order to make the prose actually work for me, I felt very much like I was reading an academic paper without the really interesting stats, is kind of how I felt. It's well researched. There's a lot of great research into grief that happens in this book, mostly in the first half of the book. The ending, I really couldn't tell you what happened because it's really just a missing on her thoughts, and her thoughts change and kind of morph throughout the book. I really struggled with this. I want to say something good about it because the insights were so amazing, but I really did not enjoy reading this book. Now, sometimes when I read a book, or depending on the life stage I'm at or whatever, a book may work for me when I'm younger and then not work for me 10 years later, or vice versa. And who knows, in 10 years I may read this book and I may fall in love with it. Maybe I'm just not mature enough to understand this book. Maybe I haven't read enough nonfiction to understand this book. I mean, to love this book. I mean, I understood it, but to really love it, maybe it's just, it hasn't been long enough, or it's been too long or something. And I definitely give that. And so I would like to reapproach this book in, 5-10 years. But for me, this book was a big no. I would like to look more into her stuff, though. Maybe shorter essays. I feel like her writing style must be amazing for essays. It just didn't work for me in something so long. But, she's really intelligent, and her writing is academic, but also it doesn't sound like an academic writing a paper. It sounds like an academic having a conversation with you. And yeah, I think I might like her essays a lot more than I liked her memoir. So that's where I stand on Joan Didion so far. If I reapproach Joan Didion and you've read Joan Didion before, what do you think I should approach next? I mean, after my experience with Hemingway and with Raymond Carver, if I dislike someone's book, I definitely give them a second chance, because there's been more than one occasion where I read something from somebody, hated it, and then read some other of their work and slowly fell in love with them, understood them better, and then went back and reread the first thing and actually liked it better. So, I would like to explore Joan Didion a little more. I think her writing style is interesting for essay. It just didn't work for me in memoir form. So on that note, ciao.